All right, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, good evening.
Again, you might introduce yourself because I'm not sure.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Makita Hill. I'm the Assistant Director for Sandoval County Planning and Zoning Division. Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, good evening. At the last meeting, the Commission took note of the number of state, federal acts, legislation that are woven into the draft oil and gas amendment that we're reviewing, and the Commission made a request that we present some information that briefly goes over what these things are. I believe through email we have sent you the acts in their entirety. Brad Stapleton assembled all of this information so that we could send it to you, file it a piece. Very lengthy, very detailed, and my presentation will only be very brief of each one. The one thing I wanted to note about these, I'll go over the state statutes and then briefly go over the federal ones that are applicable. But in every case that I'll mention very briefly, the state process is essentially identifying an issue, a person, a commission, an advisory board, developing a set of regulations, and then oversight. There isn't anything ambiguous about these acts. They're simply done in the same fashion over and over and over again, and then they're tailored for the specific issue that you're looking at. Now, I'll start with the Oil and Gas Act in a brief mode, simply because it is, our topic. And I hope that you've had a chance to look at it. It is a very detailed document. But the most important thing about the Act is that it discusses virtually every aspect about the industry except land use and zoning, because the land use and zoning is a local government issue. So everything in the Act discusses operational, mechanical, exploration, production, distribution, revenue, all of those things. The important thing is that throughout its complexity, there isn't anything in it that conflicts with your advisory role and with the role of the county commission in viewing these as land uses. There's no conflict there, so please don't get lost in all the material, looking at all the details. Frankly, it's very interesting, and a lot of history is woven into it, but it is more a set of operational regulations, not land use regulations. And frankly, it will be the same for all the other things that we'll go through. There was some interest in the Surface Owners Protection Act because of areas in the county where there are split estates, the largest area being Rio Rancho Estates area. This act, in brief, essentially does two things. In a split estate situation, it establishes the procedures for notification between the mineral rights owner and the surface owner that they want to have a process of drilling, exploring, and getting these things. The notification requirements are very detailed, as are the potential penalties in the event that some kind of damage occurs. So the notification and the damage and the liability, that's what this act is about. And I would suggest you read that too, because it's immensely detailed, but essentially covers those two things and does include notification to the surface owner. They simply can't show up and start drilling. That would be illegal to do.
Okay, so who's responsible for sending the notice?
The operators.
Okay. And who enforces? What happens if they either don't notify or send an incomplete notification?
I actually don't know.
Do you know, Brad?
It's a question. We don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll look at the numbers.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, before staff goes further. 2-week turnaround on meetings
Yes.
is difficult. The voluminous amount of material that has to be reviewed is a lot. So if we don't know an answer, it's simply because we didn't get to that. If you want to know, just give us the question, we'll look it up and we'll have it for the next meeting. But everybody, and including the public, needs to understand there's only so much work so many people can do.
Yeah, I was surprised that actually you even wanted to touch on this topic at this meeting after 2 weeks, but that's fine. So I'll check on issues. I think in general, the briefing is fine, but one of the things that we're going to get to is, well, who's responsible for carrying out each one of these statutes or whatever, and what happens if they don't do their job?
Exactly. Yes.
Mr. Chair, basically oversight.
It's oversight.
That you had mentioned before. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, Commissioners, moving on, there are a series of other things that are cultural, health, conservation, rangeland related. I'll just go through those very quickly. Cultural Properties Act is basically a state action overviewed by the Cultural Properties Review Committee. They work in tandem with the SHPO office on cultural properties, things that are to provide for the preservation, protection, enhancement of structures, sites, and objects of historic significance within the state. Now, there is also an act for prehistoric and historic sites preservation. It's a similar piece of legislation that's overseen by the State Historic Preservation Office, but they essentially work the same. So what that means is that in the field and in the event that something is discovered, it is reported, and then these state bodies have oversight over any aspect, over any level of disturbance of the site.
So, again, quick question. The ordinance talks about a certain distance between a residence or an occupied piece of property and a potential site for oil and gas exploration or production. But there's nothing in there about historic properties with religious artifacts or religious meaning. So again, I'd be very interested to know, one, assuming that we know that potential oil development or gas development is going to occur, let's say, within 1,000 feet of the boundary of a reservation or an area that's regarded as of religious significance or of historic significance, who's responsible for ensuring that there's no contamination and disturbance of religious places and so forth?
Right.
And whether there should be language in our ordinance that also specifies the distance between a potential oil and gas development and a property that has cultural meaning. And again, if someone asserts that there is, who's responsible for working out the difference between the applicant that wants to use that particular piece of property and the claimant? Yes,
Mr. Chair. Also added, I might, is the fact that, horizontal drilling. Okay, and what safeguards are going to be in place for that as far as protecting these things we've talked about?
Mr. Chairman, if I may just go to that point, the ordinance doesn't deal with horizontal drilling because horizontal drilling is dealt with by the state. Now, that would be, for example, a good example of somebody who would come in on a zoning case and say, we're aware that there's a historic site here, and this thing is too close to that historic site. That is a citable piece of information that we can go look up on the historic record, where we can actually go, we could look that up, we could bring that back to you, and we could give you the results of that study, and then advise you from a legal point of view what to do on that. You may want to increase the setback, for example. That's a perfect example of something where a member of the public came in and gave you a piece of information that is provable, and we can go check. And then we can bring that back to you and deal with it.
Mr. Chair?
sure.
When you said the state, was that OCD?
Yes.
Okay.
But I think we need to anticipate that we could also get claims of historic or cultural importance that are not yet recorded. And we're going to need to think about how we handle those too.
My experience with SHPO is that it's the applicant's responsibility to report to SHPO if they find something on the property that they're disturbing. Otherwise, any known historic site is already on a register that can be checked out.
Yeah, but we're talking about land that's definitely in the middle of nowhere. And
Well, I understand
it's possible that somebody, that there are historic sites there or something that simply hasn't been recorded yet.
Right, and I understand that. So if an applicant is out and disturbs the land and they run into an artifact or they run into an archaeological site, for example, it's state law that they have to turn themselves in, and that's the way the law is written. And then they go from there and they work through SHPO and they work through the state and they deal with that situation.
Chairman, quick question for him. Just so I understand, from what I understand, we can control where they penetrate, but if they go horizontal, we can't restrict them, correct?
Correct.
So when you say change the
That's our
standoff
opinion.
distance, then we would have to increase it to a certain amount that we think would be not good for them as far as economically to go into another area?
Actually, from an ordinance point of view, we need to stay away from anything that would require horizontal drilling. When you get into that, now you're creating cost, burden on the applicant. That's the issue that we have to be careful of, is requiring horizontal drilling. So, for example, if you went to a 1 mile setback, I've already had that question. We already discussed that with OCD. That becomes problematic from a legal point of view.
Yeah, go ahead,
Mr. Chair. Okay, Mike.
Why?
How many times do we have to say, don't speak out of order? Go ahead.
Okay, Michael. OCD, I'm a little concerned about OCD and the fact that they are having a hard time policing because they don't have enough people to inspect the wells. And it was a very low percentage, I forget what it was, but it was an extremely low percentage of them actually going out and doing inspections. Why is it that the state deals with horizontal and that is it? I mean, I'm a little concerned about OCD and them not able to, do the inspections that they should, and they've admitted that they don't have enough personnel to do so. So I just don't understand why does it cut off at horizontal drilling and OCD deals with it.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, that's exactly why we had Heather give you a presentation on preemption.
Okay.
I've looked at those cases also. The courts don't recognize that. They don't say that. What they say is that the state has a law that they are going to deal with these issues. They have given us the ability to deal with other certain issues.
Right.
The courts have not said, well, because OCD doesn't have enough inspectors, which is an opinion,
Right.
okay? Which is an opinion, it's not a fact,
Right.
that a county can just go out and do it. That's not the way the law states, and that's not what preemption is. The law says OCD does that. The county does land use.
Yeah. I guess I'm uncomfortable with them not being able to handle what they've got.
As we've told a lot of the public, and I'll say here, that argument, that discussion is left for a better place. Of course, anybody can bring it up here, and that's fine, but that's a legislative matter at the legislature, or an issue with OCD itself that should be brought to OCD's attention.
Any other questions? Okay, Mr.
Mr. Vice Chair, Commissioners, going on, I'll review very briefly some wildlife and rangeland protection material that is also under the auspices of the state. The Wildlife Conservation Act is under the auspice of the New Mexico State Game Commission, and purviews threatened or endangered habitats, and seeks to the extent possible, enhance numbers within the carrying capacity of the habitat. The Rangeland Protection Act that is listed on the board has more to do with rangeland protection with respect to brush and weed management programs. Now, these two things are out in the open, habitat rangeland driven, And the point of this is that this is the kind of setting that is identified by the state at the time of application. An application contains a variety of things, but obviously contains a certain specific site where they are proposing to drill. These kinds of habitat things are identified at that time, and these commissions are charged with those responsibilities and the rules and regulations that go along with preserving the habitat and the rangeland. So now, there is a Solid Waste Act that I'll go over very briefly. The governing board is the New Mexico Environmental Improvement Board, and where that touches upon the oil and gas activities in the state, this act touches upon three general things statewide: source reduction and recycling, environmentally safe transformation, and third, environmentally safe landfill disposal. So the landfill disposal, the injection wells, that is where the oil and gas industry comes into play with this act. And all of those things are permitted at the state level. So whatever level of activity we have going on within the county jurisdiction, the aspect of the industry that has to do with waste is governed by this act and by that third portion. Okay. Now, the state also... Yes, Commissioner.
Yeah, so are they also responsible for the enforcement of that?
Yes. Yes. Okay. Commissioners, the Water Quality Act is a lengthy piece of legislation in that it has an overall water quality control commission, but it has a number of constituent agencies that are involved in the enforcement of this act, and I will read them because many of them you've probably seen before in various cases that have come through for your review, and probably many oil cases that we may have. The constituent agencies of the act are the New Mexico Environment Department, the Office of the State Engineer, the Interstate Stream Commission, the Department of Game and Fish, Oil Conservation Commission, State Parks Division, Department of Agriculture, Soil and Water Conservation Commission, and the Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources. So the Water Quality Act is something of a networked piece of legislation, and it crosses many departments and agencies throughout the state, and obviously touch upon the oil and gas. This act is basically broken into two portions: narrative standards, designated uses of the waters, and the water quality criteria necessary to protect such uses. The second portion has to do with regulations to prevent or abate water pollution in the state or in any specific geographic area. It goes into much more detail on these things, as you can imagine, but the Water Quality Act is something of a network piece of legislation statewide. Now, those were the state acts that were identified. There were 4 federal ones, and I'll just touch upon them very briefly. When you go from state to federal, the level of complexity and the number of pages involved increases exponentially. There is the U.S. Archaeological Resource Protection Act under the Department of Interior. The Energy Policy Act itself is about 1,200 pages. So you could imagine, and that has oil and gas information also. These are more national priorities and energy policies that are in force everywhere and touch upon state regulations, but they are on a national stage. There is one federal act of interest to us, which is the U.S. Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, that has to do with establishing emergency response plans. The governor appoints commissions, individuals, state level, county level, local level, to not only putting together emergency response plans, but to notify the public that the plans are in place and what they are. And may designate emergency planning districts and local emergency planning committees by agreement. In making such designation, the State Emergency Response Commission shall indicate which facilities are subject to this act. Generally, industries are targeted and their locations for these kinds of emergency response programs, including this one. And that's why it's included in the list of actions that are in the ordinance. And the last one is the U.S. National Historic Preservation Act, which has more to do with the National Register of Historic Places. But part of the National Historic Preservation Act has to do with establishing state historic preservation programs. So all of our historic preservation programs are established at the state level, but the legislation for it is actually born out of the federal level. So there is interaction between federal and state when it comes to historic preservation. So I know that that was a lot, and happy reading. I'm still going through it myself, but just to touch upon a little bit about what this material is about. Do you have any questions?
Yes, sir. If I could, just one of the things that I would ask, and I know we're putting a lot on y'all, is that if you could, some questions that I'll continually have is, okay, who's responsible, and then who enforces it, and do we have any say in it? And if so, your recommendations. So just, as we go through all these, and I know there's 1,200 pages.
Right.
I haven't had a chance to read them yet, I'll be honest.
Commissioner Brown, you make a good point, and just so I've said it, there is a lot here that we need to be acquainted with and will require more study. The point of a discussion about preemption is to make sure what is ours and what isn't. But to identify who is in charge of something, how they regulate it, how they do the business, is not an infringement on what they do. We do need to be about identifying who is in charge and who is responsible for those things.
That's my concern, is that we'll create something and then we won't have the ability to monitor or enforce it. And so what's the point?
Mr. Chair, which could lead to ineffectiveness.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I understand that argument, I understand that concern. But that's not the way the law is written, and that's not the way it's interpreted, and it's not the way the courts have held. You may have concerns about the effectiveness of an agency doing its job. You may. I understand that. But the law doesn't recognize that. And this is a big national issue right now, because somebody doesn't think an agency is doing a good job. They take it upon themselves to do that job. The courts have held that we cannot do that. And I understand that argument. I hear that more than I hear anything else, is the effectiveness of OCD, the effectiveness of their inspections. I've heard that. But unfortunately, that doesn't give the county the right to go do their job. The state's already enumerated their responsibilities, and that's their responsibility. They've enumerated our responsibilities, and that's what we're doing here with this ordinance.
Just as a follow-up, if I may, that was not my intent. My intent was to clearly define the lanes in the road, if you will, so that I know, okay, why are we even talking about this? Maybe some of the things that I will say is, okay, this is outside of our jurisdiction. We have no authority here. We can say whatever we want, but we're wasting our time.
Correct.
I only want to do things that are constructive.
Commissioner Brown, Michael, I just want to state that I think you bring up a good point. A lot of what we're discussing is outside the parameters of what we're basically charged to do here within our jurisdiction. And I think it's important for the public to understand that although a lot of what we're discussing falls under other state and federal regulations, and OCD has their set of regulations to follow as well, I think we just need to stay focused basically on how we can best either move a proposal forward to amend this ordinance that currently exists, which has very little language, or leave it as it is, currently is, and deal with it on a case-by-case basis under special use. So with that said, I do appreciate what you just said, Mr. Hill. I think that, again, some of these things that Mr. Hill just read are basically state and federal, preemptions that currently exist. We're, I think, trying to enlighten the public and especially the commissioners of what's out there already. But again, we just need to narrow, I think, our focus on what we can do for this county and basically at our level and concentrate on that, because a lot of the times we spend a lot of time on things that we are outside, definitely our jurisdiction.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you. Michael?
We can move forward into definitions if you'd like, or you can move forward on to public testimony. It's up to you, Mr. Chairman.
I think I'll leave that to the commissioners here. I don't know if you want to hear, or you can read the definitions at your leisure. If you want some explanation on some of the definitions that are currently listed here, we're not going to change the definitions. We can give it basically some feedback on clarification of what they mean, but as far as what's here, we can either go through them or we can go ahead and take that on our own.
Can I explain that to you, Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
how these were done? Of course, we have borrowed definitions from other ordinances, but specifically, when we were working with OCD's attorneys, that was a very particular area of concern for OCD, is to make sure not only were our definitions consistent with state law and state statutes, but also didn't conflict with their definitions. The definitions that you have, and hopefully we can move through this section real quick, unless you have specific questions about a definition, is these definitions have been gone over 3 separate times now by the OCD attorneys. Every single word, I can assure you, we spent hours on these definitions. They relate specifically to everything that's in the ordinance. What they found in some cases is because we had borrowed from other counties, that we had definitions for things that were not covered. And that's a problem with other county ordinances too. But I can assure you that these definitions have been well gone over by legal staff at OCD, and they do not conflict with OCD's functions at all.
Again, Commissioner, would you like to go through, I see they're in alphabetical order, but go through definitions and see if there's any clarification or that we need assistance in trying to understand what's defined there. I don't know if Commissioner, do you have a copy since
I've got an extra copy.
there should be in the draft?
If I may, is it possible, Michael, for y'all to talk about the definitions, that the common ones that have misconceptions, and just hit those as a kind of a high point? Because otherwise, I will, I probably want to read through them myself, and then maybe next time have specific questions.
And that's fine, because what we're doing is almost doing a work plan in front of the public, which I understand is making legislation is messy. And we can do that if you want at the next meeting, give you the opportunity to go through the definitions to see if you have any concerns or any questions. There were a couple, of course. The big one for them was on page 7, oil and gas facility and facilities. That thing has been worked over 10 times. It is absolutely precise as OCD recommends to us. The other one, because it's a very complicated matter, has to do with reserve pits on number 9. The reserve pit definition was worked carefully with OCD also, because that does have a direct bearing on activities that are allowed from a land use point of view later on in the text. Those were 2 big ones.
Mr. Smith, could you expand on the conversation? and give us what you guys were talking about? What were you dealing with? Some detail as far as what went into these two specific definitions.
Most of the conversation had to do with jurisdictional boundaries and what the county can do and what OCD can do. They did help us with those jurisdictional conflicts and trying to write legislation that made sure that we stayed within our bounds and we didn't step on their bounds. It may seem like a trivial thing, but a word or a word and makes a big difference in the legal world, whether we're stepping on their toes or not.
Could you be more specific exactly?
Well, when we were doing reserve pits, for example, you have to be careful that you don't talk about construction of reserve pits, how they function, where you dispose of them, those types of things. But from a land use point of view, for example, OCD felt comfortable that we could say in an urbanized area that because of some of the impacts of reserve pits, that from a land use point of view, we could enforce this definition. So, for example,
is that what you mean? This is my
no. Actually, in this text, it doesn't allow reserve pits in the urbanized areas. But we have to be careful. This is when you're dealing with the lawyers. For example, we don't say you have to do this type of waste management. But we can pick out a certain particular land use, which is a reserve pit, sitting up on top of the soil, and say that that would be prohibited. There are many other ways that OCD allows an operator to dispose of their waste. We did not get involved in that. We do not get involved in that because they regulate that. But from a land use point of view, for example, OCD felt comfortable that we could define it and restrict it.
Commissioner, and that points out to the red areas there, the rural areas.
Correct.
Where under this land use ordinance, it would be that no reserve pits would be constructed.
Correct. So it had to go hand in hand. It had to go with you're defining something or you're calling something out, and then you're talking about it later in the text. We had to be careful about not only the definition but also the language that we use in the text itself. So they helped us work through those issues.
Thank you, Michael. I think for the benefit of the public, and there's several of you here tonight, is that maybe for the definitions, if there's nothing specific at this point in time, that maybe something that we can do is maybe meet with the staff, not as a group, because that would probably have a quorum, but individually or a couple come in and if you have specific concerns about a definition or need more clarification, we could work with you, Michael.
Oh, absolutely. Anytime you
On
want.
help.
Sure.
Nelson, for that.
I think, Vice Chairman, we probably should open it up for public comment since we have so many folks here that would like to speak, but observe the 3-minute rule.
Okay,
I'll second that.
thank you, Commissioner Ryan. Since John's not here tonight, I'm not going to be as lenient as John was last time. What we're going to do, and I think you mentioned this at the beginning, is that we're going to hold this to 3 minutes. We're going to allow you, the public, to come in and speak. There will be absolutely no turning over of your minutes to another individual here tonight. We're going to keep it that if somebody wants to speak, they come up and speak. We do not want somebody to be here for 30 minutes speaking on somebody else's behalf or because they have garnered their minutes.
I'm going to say that's not fair. You
we
need
want-
to allow people to give minutes. We have a lawyer who needs time to speak.
We're going to allow these for 3 minutes. There'll be several opportunities for you to speak because what ends up happening is that we do not get to hear other people speak. This will be held to 3 minutes, 3 minutes only. Do I
Mr.
Cowards. Cowards.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
if I may, it has to be said because it's important that the planning commission understand the difference between quasi-judicial and legislative work. They're quasi-judicial.
Oh, boy.
The law is clear. You have to allow public testimony. You have to be careful how you allow that public testimony. And I'm sure the attorney can speak to that. Legislative matters are much different. You do not even have to allow public testimony at all. You don't have to allow public comment at all. The county of Sandoval
Like
has
that,
always...
Mr. Springfield.
Let's hold it, please. You will have a chance to speak. Let Michael finish, please.
The county of Sandoval, and particularly this body, has always been very open to listening to the public and trying to reflect the concerns of the public. But it must be said, you don't have to. When I hear comments that you have to let us talk, you have to do this, you have to let us do a presentation, that is simply not the case. So I just say that for the record.
Thank you very much.